Hi everyone, today I am here with a classics reading wrap up, and it's a very exciting one because it's filled with lots of my favourite authors and books that I thoroughly enjoyed, so I can't wait to share with you all the classics that I have read lately. I've been so into my classics lately and I'm not entirely sure why it is, but I think that there is something so nice about sitting down with an old book in the evening when the nights are drawing in, it's getting darker, autumn is finally here. This is my favourite time of the year to read classics. So I've got quite the selection to show you. Let's get into it. The first classic I read was Sparkling Cyanide by Agatha Christie, which I must say is probably the Agatha Christie I've been most looking forward to read because it sounded like it would be just my thing. This is a standalone of hers. There are some loose connections with other books that she's written, but you can read this without knowing about a specific detective involved. It's not a Miss Marple book or a Poirot book, for example. And I must say that I think I enjoy her standalone crime novels more than I do the ones that are linked to a specific detective. I don't mind Poirot, I probably prefer Miss Marple, but there is something about having a self-contained story that I think just allows her to shine. The first chapters that make up the first part of Sparkling Cyanide each follow a different character as they recount the events of a year before when a woman called Rosemary Barton died at a dinner party that they were all in attendance of. So we have characters like Rosemary's sister, Iris, we have her husband's secretary, we have Rosemary's husband. The book goes into detail about why each of these characters might have murdered Rosemary. While Rosemary's death was not assumed to be a murder at first, it becomes very apparent that in fact she was murdered at the dinner party. What I really loved about it is that each chapter, particularly at the beginning, feels like an unreliable narration. I'm not sure who is keeping something from me, who is telling the truth, where are the gaps in the narrative. It becomes very obvious that you very much are reading through someone's eyes and you are seeing their biases and you are not sure what's a secret, what is truth, and you just know that you cannot trust anyone. I'm not sure what this says about me, but I found one of the surprising things about reading Sparkling Cyanide was that I sort of was rooting for the characters to have murdered her. Like, I would read one chapter and I'd be like, this is a really good motive. I think you should be the one who's murdered Rosemary. And then I'd read the next chapter and I was like, oh, actually, I think it should have been you. And I won't say if any of my suspicions were correct because you have to read it for yourself to find out who the murderer was. But I did find it interesting that actually I was rooting for a really strong motive, and I found that the depths that Agatha Christie went to in this book to establish very valid, well, valid maybe isn't the word, but very interesting and very complex reasons why somebody would have murdered Rosemary, who you don't feel a lot of sympathy for in the book. She's quite an unlikable character, and I like an unlikable character. I found her very interesting to read about through everybody else's eyes. I don't want to give any spoilers, but I will say that the thing that I'm finding with Agatha Christie is that I love her books, but I read them for the journey rather than the outcome at the end of who the murderer is. If I was to hold that most important as I was reading this finale, this showdown, this sort of result of who has murdered, I think I would be disappointed, and that isn't the sole fault of this book. I think it is just a sort of feature of Agatha Christie's books, is that the journey, the working it out for yourself, is far better than any sense that you've got it right or wrong. And I'm just finding the more that I read of her, the more common that experience is. So the key with Agatha Christie is to trust no one, be suspicious of everyone. Next up we have Summer by Edith Wharton, which I've been meaning to read for years, and I'm so glad that I did. I had been spoiled for this many years ago and I was very upset about it, and it put me off reading it. And then I read it and realised that somebody had lied to me because the thing that they spoiled me for didn't happen, which was actually a very good thing in the end. I love Summer and I love Edith Wharton's books, but this one, I don't know if it was the time that I read it, it was just what I needed. It reminds me of everything that I love about Edith Wharton's books, and it's very short. Like, it's one of her shorter novels, comparable to Ethan Frome in sort of the subjects that it deals with, the setting that it's based in, but also just in the way that she manages to condense so much story in so few pages. I think a lot is given to short books these days. We all lead busy lives, we want to read shorter novels, many of us do, but I think that the lesson I can take away from reading Summer is that sometimes short books can be the most powerful and they can really pack a punch. Summer is set in an extremely rural community, a village called North Dormer in New England, and our main character is a young woman called Charity Royal who has known for her whole life that rather than being from North Dormer, she was instead taken down from a very remote mountain community and brought up by a man who was not her father. This mountain community is frequently referred to in the novel as this backwoods place, which is rife with poverty, where there is no opportunity, where the people don't even really speak the same language as the people from North Dormer. And whilst North Dormer is not the most happening of places, Charity, for example, works in the library where nobody ever visits. Its inclusion means that 3 different levels of society are being explored in the book. You have the lowest of the low, the mountain community, you have North Dormer where nothing happens, and then you also get the main town, this exciting world of commerce and opportunity and culture, which in many ways is othered just as much as the mountain community is. Charity's life changes at the beginning of the novel when she meets Lucius Harney, who is an architect visiting North Dormer in order to document the houses and sort of the historic properties that are there. Lucius comes from New York, which is very much treated as this otherworldly place that never quite feels real in the book. It feels like not just something to aspire to, but something that is so far out of reach that it will never ever be possible. As a place, it's absolutely so far out of the reaches of the characters that live in North Dormer that you never quite get a grasp of it. Very different to lots of Edith Wharton's old New York novels like The Age of Innocence, like The House of Mirth, where she is portraying very high New York society. This is the total opposite. I've been thinking a lot since I read this about the role of love stories and how we sort of think about love in classic novels, particularly at this time, a Victorian novel for example. I've been thinking a lot about how maybe I would have perceived characters with some sort of romantic element to their stories as a teenager, and how I perceive them now with a lot more life experience, having read a lot more, having lived a lot more, and how nowadays, where romance stories are so pervasive, reading something like Summer by Edith Wharton, where a romantic relationship is central to the book, but actually it's not something that you can add heart eyes to, it's not something that you can romanticize, or something that indeed should be romanticized. The other thing I'd like to talk about in relation to Summer, without giving any spoilers, is that there are a few scenes in this book which are set in an abortion clinic, in this backstreet, very secretive but also reputable abortion clinic, and that really surprised me in the way that Edith Wharton talked about it, in this matter-of-fact way that it's dealt with in the book, but also how powerful that is, because it is seen as this extraordinary event that is very mundane in the way that it is dealt with, and I thought that that was so skillful, and that is something that is going to stay with me for a long time. I think those sorts of scenes are what Edith Wharton does best. I'm thinking too of the ending of The House of Mirth. She goes into this other world that is so different to the societies that she's portraying, but they're very real, and I think that what Edith Wharton does best is that I don't ever feel with her books like she is being overly moralistic. I feel like she's just exploring a world that absolutely existed, that people knew about, that people had used at this time. She doesn't shy away from the taboo, but neither does she shy away from the stigma that would have been involved, for example, in walking into an abortion clinic at this time period. She manages to write about such difficult topics in a way that does feel full of understanding and empathy towards her characters, which I think is really quite rare for this period. I still don't feel like I've fully digested Summer. It's a book I will definitely reread because I think I would get so much out of a reread, and you'll be hearing a lot more about it because I love talking about it. If you've watched any of my videos over the years, you might know how much I love Thomas Hardy. He is one of my favourite authors. I've always loved his stories, and I've read so many of his books now that I can't quite keep track. But my latest Thomas Hardy read was The Mayor of Casterbridge. I don't think this is going to be a new favourite Thomas Hardy, but I still really enjoyed it and I think it's a great book. So The Mayor of Casterbridge opens up with an iconic first chapter. In it, our main character Michael Henchard and his wife Susan are attending a fair, and at this time a fair was an opportunity for people to gather, to find work, to sell livestock. It was a staple of agricultural society. Michael Henchard is searching for work. He's a labourer. A labourer was a very poor member of society. He goes to this fair to look for work, but it's out of season. Michael is with his wife and daughter, and they go into a tent where they partake of alcoholic beverages, and he becomes very, very drunk and decides that he is going to sell his wife. This was based on a real story that Thomas Hardy heard about, and he wrote it down in his notebook and saved it so that he could one day write about it. So Michael Henchard sells his wife. Her and her child go off and live with a sailor. They are not heard or seen of for many, many years. And when we pick back up on their story, the daughter is no longer a small child but is now a young lady, and she's travelling into Wessex to the town of Casterbridge to seek out a relative that her mother has talked about called Michael Henchard. They're not sure if he's alive, where he might be, but they follow a trace and they discover that their relative, Michael Henchard, who the daughter has no clue is her father, is now the mayor of Casterbridge. To put it into context, rising from a labourer, the bottom rungs of society, into a position of privilege and to become a business owner and somebody that society respects is no mean feat at this time. The book is subtitled The Life and Death of a Man of Character and was also serialised first before it was published in a full edition. And I think that's one of the downsides. It's where Thomas Hardy goes wrong. He's so focused for the majority of the novel on portraying Michael Henchard's rise and fall. He is so focused on these things that happen to Michael to raise him up into this man of privilege and then to take that privilege away from him that it almost becomes melodramatic in its extremes. He's so focused on putting Michael through hell that he forgets about believability and plausibility. And I think that it's really important to show how volatile living in this society was, how one misstep can take you down a very different path. But there's just then so much going on in the book that doesn't feel like anything can really breathe. I liked the characters, I didn't love them. I enjoyed reading about Michael, but as more unfortunate events took place and as they affected him, I got weary. Thomas Hardy didn't realise what he's good at in this book, which is delivering a really impactful ending. I feel like it just doesn't have the force of Thomas Hardy's usual writing in the way that it could, because there's just so much happening along the way that I think about books like Jude the Obscure, which honestly had me throwing the book across the room because I couldn't believe what he'd just written, or Tess of the D'Urbervilles, where you feel so close to Tess throughout and you really feel everything she's going through. I think about The Woodlanders, which I burst into tears. I could not finish reading it for ages because I was crying so much. The Mayor of Casterbridge just doesn't do that, which I think is really disappointing. I think it has such potential for a really good book, and yet it doesn't quite deliver. It didn't fall flat. I loved it. I loved the writing. But it's definitely a book that I can heavily critique. It's not quite as bad as The Trumpet Major for me. It's just not going to be a new favourite Thomas Hardy. He wrote a lot of books, so it's not not a major disappointment. Then I read To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf. I have again wanted to read this for years. I started it a few times and I found it hard going. Virginia Woolf is not the easiest of writers to read because she had her own unique style of stream of consciousness. So you basically feel as you are reading her books like you are in somebody's head and you're reading all of their thoughts. And just like our thoughts, full of tangents and new directions and messiness, the characters are experiencing that same thing too, which is wonderful, but it does take some adjusting to. The Lighthouse follows the Ramsey family who have a holiday home that they are entertaining at. There is Mrs. Ramsey, who really is the central character in this book, her children, her husband, and then a multitude of other characters. My favourite being Lee Briscoe, who is an artist. So we get lots of really interesting discussions on creativity and what it means to be creative and to create art. I think the thing that I will take away from this book, and not just in terms of the books that I read, but just into life, is just how powerful its explorations of grief are. And I still can't fully talk about how I felt while I was reading certain sections of this book, particularly this midsection where you really are delving into the passage of time and grief, and then you come back and everything feels very dark and very lost. It feels like there is something missing, and that's exactly what Virginia Woolf wants to create. And I still can't fully comprehend everything that she did because I just found it genius. This book is a perfect companion for grief. It's very cathartic and was influenced by Virginia Woolf's own life and her own grief. This was one that I read and highlighted and underlined extensively. One of my favourite lines was, "For now, she need not think about anybody. She could be herself by herself." And that was what now she often felt the need of. To think. Well, not even to think. To be silent, to be alone. All the being and the doing, expansive, glittering, vocal, evaporated, and one shrunk with a sense of solemnity to being oneself, a wedge-shaped core of darkness, something invisible to others. I loved To the Lighthouse. I surprised myself at how much I loved it, and I would insist that you all read it if you haven't already, because it is, quite honestly, I think one of the best books that has ever been written, one of the best books in the English language, and it's a perfect representative of everything that's brilliant about Virginia Woolf's writing. And finally, we have a book that I didn't enjoy as much as the others, but I still think deserves to be talked about because I think it's one you probably haven't heard of or probably haven't read. This is Olivia by Dorothy Strachey, linked in many ways to the last book I talked about because this is dedicated in the memory of Virginia Woolf because Dorothy Strachey was associated with the Bloomsbury Group. It follows Olivia, a young lady who is sent away to Paris to finishing school, and there she falls in love with her school mistress. In many ways this felt like a very claustrophobic, very cloying, very annoying narrative of young teenage love and your first teenage crush. It feels very relatable in many ways, in probably the worst way, because it sort of brings back secondhand embarrassment. I can't say that I loved any of the characters in this book, and at many points I was quite confused about the narrative because we start with an introduction where the autobiographical nature of the book is discussed, and then we go immediately into the first chapter where that voice feels very similar. It feels almost identical. So I was never quite sure if the introduction was from Dorothy Strachey, or is it part of the feature of the novel? Is it our main character Olivia introducing her own book? I was never quite convinced either way. It feels like a book that doesn't know its own purpose. I think when we're talking about literary merit, we've got to be very careful that we don't place too much emphasis on perfect writing. An author like Virginia Woolf has a very clear place in the literary canon now. Something like Olivia will get overlooked and ignored because it absolutely is not a perfect piece of fiction. But I think its place within the queer literary canon cannot be understated and absolutely should be highlighted. I absolutely think we should be talking talking about this book alongside other books of the period from the 20th century, books by Radcliffe Hall, by E.M. Forster, Evelyn Waugh. I've been reading Brideshead Revisited lately. I think we need to be talking about the emphasis that many of these books place on an ending, and how there can only be very few acceptable endings for people who aren't straight, who have relationships or who have feelings towards people of the same sex. Like, I really think those are such important conversations to be had. It's why I love an author like E.M. Forster, who places an emphasis on a happy ending, which is so subversive that it had basically never been done before. A book like this at this time period will always fall into a mould towards the ending, because it absolutely would not have been accepted for two queer characters to have a happy ending. Morris by E.M. Forster is such a brilliant book, because he absolutely says right from the beginning that a happy ending is necessary. This has no happy ending. It doesn't really have an ending. It's a book that is very much focused on teenagerhood, on young girlhood, and first forays into sexuality and understanding your sexuality. Because the characters aren't particularly strong, because they're not particularly memorable in many ways, the ending just feels like a non-event. It doesn't feel like we're leading anywhere. It just feels like a footnote rather than something that adds to the story in any way. I'm really glad that I read it. It is a very short book, and I'm so glad it wasn't any longer, because I don't think I would have wanted to spend any more time with it. It did what it had to do, and then I put it down and that was it, and I was quite happy with that as a reading experience. If you're looking for a book that's going to change your life, I'm not sure if this is it, but despite that, I would recommend reading it. Thank you so much for watching my reading wrap up. I would love to know in the comments what classics you have been reading lately, and maybe I'll pick up some recommendations for my next wrap up. Happy reading!